After the more action-heavy Resident Evil 4 and the totally ludicrous Resident Evil 6, it would seem as though Capcom was ready to move on from action games and chase the next popular trend. Following in the footsteps of slower first-person horror games, such as Amnesia, Outlast, and Alien Isolation, Resident Evil 7 seemed like it might be yet another departure from tradition. And that's not entirely wrong, but it would be unfair to claim that this entry is anything but a Resident Evil game. In fact, I'd argue that this is more like the classic titles than anything that's been released in the last decade. All of the elements here are what you would expect from Resident Evil, while throwing in its own surprises all the same. I can see this entry being a divisive one, and there are some flaws that I'm not happy with. But overall, I found my time at the Baker residence to be a wonderful and memorable experience. Resident Evil 7 brings on a cast of brand new characters and in a setting that's unusual for the franchise. But while it might feel like a soft reboot at first, the good old-fashioned Resident Evil story beats do make their way around eventually, along with tie-ins to the rest of the series' lore. That's not to say that any previous knowledge whatsoever is needed for this entry, as it stands on its own perfectly fine. So it can be argued that this is not a bad spot for newcomers wanting to get into the franchise. Ethan Winters receives a chilling video from his wife Mia urging him to abandon her and not seek her out, wherever that might be. 3 years later, Mia finally sends an email divulging her location as the coastal town of Dulvey, Louisiana. You've probably heard of the rest of the setup from here.
Welcome to the family, son.
The address where Ethan went to look for Mia turns out to be owned by the Bakers, a deep southern family who are eccentric and very violent. They all tolerate Ethan at first, but when it becomes clear that he has no interest in joining the family, their intentions quickly turn to murder. Ethan has to find Mia and escape the Baker's house, all while discovering their history along the way.
Don't you just slip out before dinner was done?
The story has your typical horror movie stupidity, like why doesn't Ethan immediately call the police upon receiving Mia's email? But little details like that can be easily looked over. What's a little tougher to ignore is how Ethan takes the whole situation in stride. I mean, yeah, he gets shocked and scared every now and then, but then sometimes it seems like this isn't that big of a deal for him.
What the fuck? Well, that's special.
My initial theory was that Ethan might secretly be some sort of special agent with experience in this kind of thing, and I expected some sort of plot twist in this regard. But that doesn't happen. Ethan occasionally laughs off the horrors, which is kind of an immersion breaker when Resident Evil 7 is trying to be more horror focused than the previous games.
I just got done dealing with your mom and her fucking bugs. Wish you could have warned me.
Sorry about that. What about the serum?
Furthermore, it's worth mentioning that one character in particular just disappears during the later half of the game, which leaves a pretty shocking plot hole that the story never gets back to. Instead, a free DLC chapter properly concludes the game. That's okay, but that DLC came out about 11 months after launch, which is very strange to conclude the game's story so late. In the grand scheme of things, those parts of the story are easily forgiven because there's a lot of good here too. The designs and dialogue of the villains are all great, and they help differentiate from each other very well. Jack steals the show. He's intimidating, cocky, and absolutely hilarious.
Oh boy! Now look what you've done, motherfucker! This is the end, you know?
He's by far one of my more favorite villains in a while, but the other two members of the Baker family do a great job as well.
Come here, boy.
Oh shit, he's not Ethan, Jack! He's not Ethan!
Shut the hell up, Marguerite!
Ethan for him!
Get the hell out of here!
You're a son of a bitch!
The eventual plot twist towards the end of the game is easy to see coming if you're paying attention, and it's debatable as to how good it is. I think it's done well because it sprinkles some hints here and there without making a big deal of the mystery, which is part of why I hated Degeneration and Survivor so much. In Resident Evil 7, the mystery isn't as buried, but it still feels satisfying when it's revealed because it's not in your face about it for the whole game. There's also a very video game centric form of pacing. There's a lot of pushing and pulling and running around. You need this key and now you need this item, and oh, this door is locked, so now you need to come back later. Normally I would find that sort of thing a little bit annoying, but I feel like this pulls off the right balance for two main reasons. The player is always going somewhere that's visually engaging and looks different, and secondly, nothing is ever too far away. It rarely feels like the game is wasting your time, and whenever you're sent from one corner of the map to the other, it's never a long trip, there's usually an obstacle to deal with along the way, and it helps build a lot of tension. Like, when I was told that I need to go all the way back to the dissection room in the main house's basement, I wasn't thinking about how long the trip was going to be or how much this game drags its feet. Instead, I was deciding on whether or not I should take the shotgun or the grenade launcher for this, and anticipating the general challenges that might come up. I was wondering if the game was going to revive a boss that I killed there earlier, or if some other crazy story element was going to occur. The setting was pulled off effectively enough that I managed to ignore the incessant backtracking and more effectively immerse myself in the experience. Unfortunately, one thing that did bring me out of the experience was the occasional lighting adjustment that happens throughout the game. I assume this is supposed to simulate Ethan's eyes adjusting to the environment, however more than half the time it doesn't seem to work properly and it came off as really obnoxious. Playing this game in VR and whenever this happened was always a major grievance to me, and it happened way too often. The overall presentation has some hit and miss, as does the gameplay. Resident Evil as a franchise, especially the older games, has always been known for its low variety of enemies, but this latest entry really pushes that boundary. My complaint with Resident Evil Revelations is multiplied tenfold here. There are only a grand total of 5 enemy types, and aside from the bugs, they all carry the same exact design. You have the typical normal zombie, you have the version with a giant blade for a hand who's a little tougher to take down, there's the one that crawls on all fours and is very quick, there's the mini-boss, the fat zombie with projectile vomiting right out of Metal Slug 3, and finally, the bugs. That is the entire enemy roster. No hunters, no lickers, no dogs, no giant spiders, not even a kamikaze type to add some simple variety. This is by far the biggest disappointment in the game, and there's no reason for it. Give me a couple of enemies that look and act at least a little bit differently, because man, this is really bad. The designs are really cool, but you can't just make a couple of them and then copy-paste them throughout the rest of the game. On the other hand, the saving grace of the game comes in the combat. Aiming a gun comes with about a second of waiting for the crosshairs to become precise, allowing the player to either take it slow or fast, both with their own risks, and either or will be required depending on the situation. This can create some tense moments as enemies start to close in, forcing the player to rely on rapid and inaccurate shots in desperation. It's a small and simple implementation, but one that's well executed. This is complemented by a guarding mechanic. Enemy attacks can be blocked and countered with proper timing. The trick is that guarding has a bit of a startup and it cannot be done immediately after attacking, so there's a necessary balance between favoring offense or defense. As the player learns how an enemy moves, it becomes easier to figure out which attacks can be sidestepped or backed away from, preventing damage altogether. On top of everything, the most drastic change has to be that the knife is not completely useless in this game. Thanks to the guarding mechanic, it's not an unrealistic strategy to simply go toe-to-toe with enemies and continuously trade blows, guarding and dodging whenever possible and healing whenever necessary. This is what I did for about the first quarter of the game without any issues. Once enemies became more dangerous and ammo far more plentiful, I eventually stopped relying on the knife. But for even the first couple of boss fights, I relied purely on melee. It certainly felt strange, but overall, I liked it. It made for fun and dynamic battles, and I feel like it adds a lot to the game. If it weren't for the guarding mechanic at the least, then the minimal enemy count would make the game such a bore. Yet this expanded combat also changed the game in another way. Resident Evil 7 starts off scary as hell. Searching a dark basement while mutated horrors patrol the halls is legitimately horrifying. But then you get used to the flow of combat and the game suddenly becomes a lot goofier. I know it's an odd thing to bring up because I do think the gameplay is great and I like the setting and design of the enemies, but it reminds me of Fatal Frame in that sense. The great gameplay gives the player something to focus on, and that helps make the game a lot less scary. And then, like most, if not all of the Resident Evil titles, it pretty much turns into a shooting gallery towards the end of the game as the player is showered in ammunition. Not really a complaint per se, but it's worth mentioning how much the game changes over time as the mechanics are mastered. Like I mentioned in the beginning, this is a Resident Evil game at its heart. Limited storage space, scrounging for supplies, and always looking for the next key to open the latest locked door. Even the general movement speed is fairly slow, and the layout of many areas makes it easy for unwitting players to accidentally corner themselves. There's also an unlockable difficulty that requires consumable items to save the game, just like in the older titles. I was afraid that the first-person implementation could easily ruin this game, but it turned out to be implemented in an extremely smart way. Aside from the first-person camera, the ability to aim precisely, and the guarding mechanic, this really does feel like a Resident Evil game through and through, and it's a great one at that. The limited enemy types does hurt the game a lot, but the expanded combat mechanics go a long way to help make up for it. I don't necessarily want to give this game glowing praise, but I never stopped having a good time. The additional downloadable content deserves extra mention as well, for both the good and the bad that's associated with it. Resident Evil 7 is a great game, but like most Resident Evil games, it's also very short. My initial playthrough finished at about 14 hours, and I was going at a very leisurely pace. I could see it being pretty easy for someone's first time through to finish this game at about 10 hours. The short length of these games are usually complemented by additional playable characters, altered or arranged campaigns, or extra modes that turn the base gameplay on its head a little. Resident Evil 7 has none of that, electing instead for an unlockable higher difficulty and secret weapons upon completing the game under certain constraints. Don't get me wrong, the Baker estate has a ton of secrets to hide that can be easily overlooked, and I'm sure that I missed plenty of them. But there is the definite nagging feeling that content was essentially missing. Content that was no doubt decided on being sold separately, which is a hard pill to swallow. This extra paid-for content comes in a lot of forms. There's a prequel to the main game which has some small elements of puzzle solving and stealth. It's really cool to see the Bakers actually act as normal people before the insanity of the main game begins. There's another short story which plays like an escape the room kind of game. Not bad, but not really anything special. 21 is an interesting twist on the classic blackjack card game, complete with power-ups to help you and hinder your opponent. I never thought I'd have this much fun playing cards in a Resident Evil game, but Capcom sure found a way. The best one for me, however, is Nightmare. This has the player taking on wave after wave of enemies while collecting currency that can be traded in for new weapons, ammo, healing items, and other upgrades, while powerful bosses show up occasionally to ruin your day. This is essentially Resident Evil 7's version of the long-running Mercenaries minigames, and it's an incredibly fun concept. The problem is that the game never takes it far enough, which is insane to me. There is a brilliant idea here, and it's been practically shelved. There could have been multiple characters with different abilities and starting loadouts, multiple maps with their own bosses, and I can even see this working out great in multiplayer. I can't believe there isn't even an infinite mode. No, you only get one character, one map, 2 difficulties, and 5 waves. The absolute bare minimum, and it's maddening to think about what could have been. For that matter, it would have been great if the blackjack minigame had a multiplayer mode too, and that one would have been really easy to include. There's no getting around it. It feels like Capcom was being extremely lazy with these. I would rather have it as is than not at all, but the ideas of what could have been really sting. The next two DLC are legitimate story expansions that basically act as a continuation from the main game. The more famous one that everyone knows about is Not a Hero, starring Chris Redfield. Just like in the past couple of Resident Evil games, Chris is able to stun a zombie with a headshot and run in to deliver a powerful punch. A simple and minor change, but one that helps differentiate it from the main game. It's still mostly more of the same, but that's really what I wanted anyway, so I'm okay with it. There are also a couple of great boss battles too, one of which is against a giant zombie that can be uppercutted and sent flying. But that's nothing compared to this DLC, End of Zoe. The main character in this game doesn't use any guns or even melee weapons. Everything here is done barehanded using a simple combo system of alternating the left and right punches. There's also spears for taking out the occasional gator, but the true ridiculousness comes from the straight up wrestling match boss battles, I kid you not. Completely over the top and hilarious. I love it. In the end, however, both of these story DLCs are too short to attribute a ton of value to them, and they don't do a whole lot of different either. The fact that I have them included in the main game is fine, but it's a lot harder to convince others to buy the DLC. The final two modes are the ones where most of the replay value can be found. Jack's 55th birthday is a race against the clock to find as much food as possible and bring it back to Jack. It's a pretty funny and lighthearted take on the game, and one with plenty of challenge to boot. It doesn't give me the same satisfaction as Mercenaries from the past games, but I'll give it some respect for trying something different and doing well at it. There's even a total of 3 maps and 2 difficulty levels, as well as a ranking system that can be very difficult to complete. The other DLC is the aptly named Ethan Must Die, and it is borderline impossible. The player must navigate the Baker house that's been riddled with powerful enemies and traps, while relying on virtually no supplies. Boxes are scattered throughout the house at random, which can offer much needed weapons or items, or they can explode and instantly kill the player. Not many mistakes can be made as one death forces a full restart. It is a brutally difficult roguelite using the Resident Evil 7 foundation. But as is the problem with roguelites as a whole, frustration is the name of the game here, and it's tough to feel motivated when deaths come suddenly and at random. Still, a cool addition all the same, and again, I respect it for doing something different. All of these DLC are pretty great, and they all offer a variety to their gameplay, but spending $30 on the Season Pass is a tough one to justify, especially considering how lacking the base game content is. These days, it shouldn't be too difficult to get a copy of the Gold Edition, which comes with the DLC included, for about $40. That, I would say, is a perfectly fair price. But I feel bad for those who bought this game on launch expecting the additional content that the series has been known for. Resident Evil 7 puts me in an odd place. I absolutely love this game, and as you've no doubt noticed, I played through the whole thing in virtual reality, which I feel drastically improves the game. Don't get me wrong, it's not worth going out to get a PlayStation 4, plus a PlayStation Virtual Reality headset, plus a copy of the game, also you can finally play Resident Evil 7 in VR, but if you already have the PS4 and the PSVR, and you're wondering about which platform to get it on, then for me, the PS4 version is an absolute no-brainer. It's also arguable that it makes the game a whole lot easier since you can aim your gun just by moving your head. With all that said, it's a shame that the last two DLC I mentioned are not compatible with virtual reality at all, and I don't understand why not. But anyway, again, I love this game, but I do have a hard time recommending it. The past few Resident Evil titles have leaned much more strongly towards action, so this slower entry feels like a departure in that sense, which some players might not be expecting. And no matter how good the combat and boss battles are, the lacking enemy variety is a massive detriment. If this game even partially sounds like something you'd be into, then jump on it right away. But if too many of its negatives sound like deal breakers to you, like the somewhat exploitable melee combat and the sometimes too silly dialogue, then it's likely you might not enjoy this game enough to see past its flaws. One thing's for sure though, I do see a lot of potential in Resident Evil 7. And I hope dearly that Capcom plans to revisit this idea sometime down the line with a bigger and better game. This last massive review on Resident Evil 7 finally wraps up this year's Halloween marathon. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching.